What a pleasure to welcome you to peacepodcast.org. I'm Barbara
Thank you,
Mueller. You're welcome. I'm Barbara Gon Mueller. I will be the hostess for this next 25 minutes. And today, as we look at Miss Honorable Melissa Parke, you will be hearing why she is the International Campaign for the Abolishment of Nuclear Weapons Executive Director. Peace Podcast is brought to you for three reasons: happiness, mutually assured survival, and peace. Peace is my middle name because I really believe that peace is possible, but it begins with each of us. And I pray that you will help us bring an end to nuclear weapons. I'm going to give you first of all, let me welcome you, Honorable Melissa Parke.
Thank you, Barbara. Melissa's just Melissa's fine.
Melissa, thank you so much for being here. She started her career as a former Australian Minister for International Development and former federal member of the Parliament for Parke, and that was 2007 to 2016. Prior to being elected to the Australian Parliament, Ms. Parke offered and worked as an international lawyer with the United Nations in Kosovo, Gaza, New York, and Lebanon, and that ended in 2007. More recently, she served as a member of the UN Group for Eminent Persons Experts on Yemen, mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate violations of international human rights and humanitarian law during the conflict in Yemen. She served as an ambassador to ICANN in Australia from 2017 to 2023. And now in 2023, she is the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I am so honored to have you here. It's like Anne Frisk said, Barbara, you have to have Melissa on your Peace Podcast. And I said, absolutely. I'm just hoping I can find a time when we both are free. You know, your background is pretty amazing. I know you're young and you have energy and you have passion. Well, would you tell us a little more about why you are so passionate about nuclear weapons, the abolishment of nuclear weapons, and how your background brought you to this point?
Well, I guess since you've got the Rotary symbol on your banner behind you, I think I should mention that I was a Rotary exchange student at the age of 17 to France, and very fortunate, my first time ever leaving Australia, and you know, it really opened up the world to me, and I got to spend a year with wonderful families in France, and to learn another culture and obviously learn another language, which has been really helpful throughout my career. But I think the most important thing is to see that while cultures and languages are different, everybody really is fundamentally the same underneath. We're all human beings, and we all, you know, want to be happy in our lives and you know, have enjoy our rights and freedoms, and without fear. And so what brought me to nuclear weapons? I guess as an Australian, I was always aware of the impact of colonisation and racism on Australia's Indigenous peoples, very much including the British history of nuclear weapons testing in my home state of Western Australia, also in South Australia, in which Aboriginal people were the primary victims, along with military veterans, and as well as the harm that was caused in the Pacific by US, British, and French nuclear weapons testing. So that was there. That's been there for a long time. That knowledge. I became involved in a campaign in the late 90s to stop an international nuclear waste dump being established in my state of Western Australia. And I've been very much involved as a younger person in environmental campaigns and in human rights campaigns. And I guess, you know, I've carried those interests with me throughout my life. as you mentioned, I worked as an international lawyer with the United Nations. For 8 years, I was in Kosovo, Gaza, and Lebanon, and New York. And then later in Yemen, and I saw firsthand the impact of war on innocent women, men, and children, and was very impacted by that. And as a parliamentarian and a Minister for International Development, I was very inspired by the example of a former Australian minister, Tom Uren, who had been a prisoner of war in Japan in World War II, just outside Nagasaki. And he witnessed the US atomic bombing of Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945. And when he came home, he became a sort of lifelong campaigner for peace and nuclear disarmament. And he said that the struggle against nuclear weapons is the most important struggle for the human race. And I think that's very, very much been my approach as well. I've spent my life fighting injustice. And in my view, there can be no greater injustice against humanity and the planet than nuclear weapons, because all they can do is destroy.
Exactly. You know, I'm watching you and I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, were you in the right place at the right time? How did your career evolve in such a meaningful way, leading you to where you are today?
Well, I think as long as one is open to opportunities that come along, you know, I think there's a lot of possibilities in everyone's life to do interesting things. And I certainly feel very lucky, but I've also always been someone who said yes to opportunities, because I always thought, I don't want to get to an age where I've regretted the things that I didn't do. I'd rather regret the things I did and where I made mistakes.
Well, you know,
having that, I never want to die, you know, saying what if, you know.
What if I would have? Yes, I understand that. When I was even a little girl, I remember writing on the chalkboard at about the age of 10. I thought, well, I always want to leave something behind that I did, even if it's writing on the chalkboard and proclamation for something. And there's leaving something behind you and the excitement of that. You can make a difference. And when my husband asked me to marry him, my second husband, and we were in the car, I said, yes, with enthusiasm, because then the energy happens. But it took me about 3 seconds to say, my life will change if I say yes to this. But he was the peacemaker, and that's what I wanted in my life. So, you know, when you say yes, then the whole world changes, because that yes has power, right?
It does. And if you think about it, everything that humankind has ever created was first imagined by someone. So those nuclear scientists in the early days, they imagined nuclear weapons and then they built them. So what we're doing is we're imagining the end of nuclear weapons and creating that. That's going to be the new reality.
Absolutely. From your lips to the powers above that will help us create this. And you know, it's contagious. When you're passionate about something, other people gather that. And like, my work for peace has been forever. And people now call me a person who knows that peace is possible. And that's why I have behind me, peace is possible. And when I joined the Rotary, it was after the World Peace Conference in 2016 that we started the Rotary E-Club of World Peace. Why? Because a conference isn't enough. We have to have support. And that's why I love these peace podcasts, because they support the people out there who are against nuclear weapons, who are against war. And I have friends who we meet on Zoom to talk about what we can do together in different countries. And right now, as you and I are talking, there's an international conference going on for Rotary on world peace in Singapore. And these conferences are great, but what happens after, right? And so that's why I'm so delighted to have you on today. So tell us about ICANN and the work that you're so involved with right now.
Well, you know, I think as I mentioned, about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the only devices ever created that have the capacity to destroy all complex life on Earth. And ICAN was started in Australia in 2007 by a small group of people sitting around a kitchen table and saying to themselves, what can we do to rid the world of the world's worst weapons? And they thought about the earlier successful campaigns to ban landmines and cluster munitions. And they thought, well, we'll follow those campaigns. And so they started a campaign to have nuclear weapons banned under international law. We've seen that banning weapons like biological and chemical weapons, as well as landmines and cluster munitions, makes them both legally and morally unacceptable to use. So it was really the only way that that non-nuclear weapon states could have a say on this matter, because the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty were and are legally obliged to disarm. But they haven't been disarming. In fact, they're doing quite the reverse right now. They're building and modernizing.
They're gearing up for peace. Is that possible?
And so, so basically, they controlled the agenda for a long time. And what ICAN did was, for decades, the narrative around nuclear weapons was controlled primarily by those who have them. And their message has been that nuclear weapons provide stability and security. Well, ICAN changed this by focusing the conversation on what would happen if, or more likely when, the weapons are used, whether by accident or design. And ICAN showed the real security impact of nuclear weapons by highlighting the incontrovertible evidence that we know from what happened in Japan, as well as from more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests carried out around the world, that nuclear weapons cause indiscriminate, catastrophic harm to humans and the environment across long periods of time, and even in regions far distant from the site of nuclear explosions. And so, science has now established that even a limited nuclear war would cause global climate disruption, leading to agricultural collapse and the death by starvation of billions of people. We're talking about the use of just a fraction of the world's global nuclear arsenal. So nuclear weapons are a problem for the collective security of humanity and for every human being. And that's why we all have a stake in this issue. Every country and every person has a right to speak out about these weapons.
They have a right to speak out, and you need to give them the words. And so as you're talking today, you've been tutored in this experience. You've seen the research. What can they, and I'm going, oh, sorry, I don't even know where my phone is. Hold on. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that, but I have an IT man, he'll take it out. But what can we do, and what can we say that demonstrate that we understand the fallacy of nuclear weapons and the destruction that they bring to our planet in the eventual goal of ending nuclear weapons threats and to bring peace?
Well, I mean, what ICAN's done is by highlighting the real world impacts of nuclear weapons, that's actually shifted the conversation around nuclear weapons from the theory that these things keep us safe to the reality of the horror that awaits all of humanity from any use of nuclear weapons. And this has empowered a broad range of stakeholders around the world, including like civil society, financial institutions, cities, communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, academics and scientists, and countries who have traditionally been sidelined in this debate. It's empowered them to stand up and demand a policy shift. And this led to the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons being adopted at the UN General Assembly in 2017 by 122 countries. And later that year, ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize for its work in highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and in helping to get this new treaty off the ground. So this is a treaty that provides for justice for those communities already impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, who've had no justice until now, very little acknowledgement, very little compensation or recognition. But it also ensures that it never happens again by prohibiting these weapons. And it really is the only bright shining light in an increasingly dark and dangerous international security environment. And so we're encouraging, ordinary people around the world to do what you can to, light your small candle for peace and for ensuring that your government signs up to this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We already have around half the countries of the world have joined the treaty, and some very big countries due to join soon this year. But of course, we also need to put pressure on those nuclear armed states and their allies who have said they will not sign the treaty for now, and to make sure that the public is giving them a very different message that, no, we do not want to be held hostage by these weapons any longer. They don't belong on our planet.
That's beautiful, because if you understand that the ramifications of nuclear weapons are so devastating, that the TPNW is that vehicle that the United Nations, our global voice, to reality. And the TPNW has been signed by over 122 countries. Is that right?
Well, it was supported, the adoption of the treaty was supported at the UN General Assembly by 122 countries in 2017. That meant that the treaty could come into being. It came into force in 2021 when there were 50 signatories, 50 members of the states parties, and now we have over 90 countries that have signed or ratified the treaty. So
out of the 192 that are members of the UN.
Yeah, around about those numbers. So it's we're getting there, and it's a very young treaty. So we've got the momentum. It's democracy too, because for many years, as I mentioned, the debate was really controlled by the nuclear armed states, and primarily those who are the permanent five of the Security Council. And now, by having this treaty in the General Assembly, it's in a place, it's more democratic because it's in a forum where every country has one vote. And so it's democratizing the treaty. And the other thing about this treaty is that it has a great participation of affected communities. The Hibakusha from Japan, those who were the victims of the atomic bombings, those who've survived, and and they're in their 80s and 90s now. They're very elderly, but they're so passionate because they never want to see this happen to anyone ever again. And so they keep coming and telling their stories over and over again, even though it must cause them a lot of pain to do so. But they do that because, all of these officials, ambassadors, states parties, representatives, they change quite regularly. And so in order to make sure that, the new people who come into these roles are hearing these stories, we have to get these poor people to tell their stories again and again. And so it's their courage. It's really their courage that has meant we have this treaty. And also, we've got scientists and academics and young people and parliamentarians, even those whose countries don't support the treaty, are all participating in this process. So it's a very dynamic and participatory treaty compared to, every other disarmament treaty you could point to.
It's so wonderful that we have the TPNW, because I have been a member of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation here in Santa Barbara for years, and my husband got the award Citizen of the Year along with Elizabeth Manmore-Gazy to prevent nuclear weapons from destroying our oceans, our livelihood, and whatever. And I remember David Krieger, he wrote a book called Hope, and he wrote poetry. Did you ever meet David Krieger?
Sadly, I didn't, because, you know, I only started this role in September last year.
And
So
he-
I didn't get to meet him, but I heard a lot about him.
Well, I'm sure he's smiling wherever he may be right now, because you have the same passion he had. He was so gentle, so wise, just like you, a gentle voice. And yet he had the logic behind him. He had Truman, he had Eisenhower, he had Frank Kelly, his speechwriter for Truman. And Frank Kelly had lived in Santa Barbara, and he coordinated the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation events. And events are wonderful. They take you into a new way of thinking. And so after you've been to the convention, after you've been to a conference, after you've been to an event, what's next? What do you think people should be telling people after they listen to this podcast today with you?
Yeah, I mean, look, the recent pop culture attention to nuclear weapons through like Oppenheimer, the release of Oppenheimer, to the new release of Godzilla, to Annie Jacobson's new book, the best-selling book called Nuclear War, A Scenario, which I highly recommend everybody to read. It's fantastic. I mean, that pop culture attention is giving us the opportunity to reach new audiences with a new understanding that nuclear weapons are a problem. They're not a solution. And that of all the global problems out there today, nuclear weapons are relatively easy to solve. Humans built nuclear weapons. Humans can dismantle them. It's really a matter of political will and leadership. Leadership is what we need. And at the moment, the global leadership on nuclear weapons is coming from mainly from the global south, along with civil society and a few countries from the global north. You know, I think that we have the momentum, and we just need, if we can get the public to tune in more to this issue now, and to speak to their financial institutions and ask them, you know, if they've got, to their banks, to their pension funds, to say, you know, do you have any money invested in nuclear weapons, in the nuclear weapons industry? And if you do, I want you to get out of it. I mean, we've already seen $4 trillion divested from nuclear weapons industry since the treaty came into force.
Wow.
And so that's already having an impact. We've got hundreds of major cities around the world, including New York and Paris and Rome, all, even though they're in nuclear armed states, those cities are saying, no, we need our country to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, because cities are the primary targets of nuclear weapons. Cities are where these bombs are going to be dropped.
Right.
And now the nuclear weapons today are so much more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which would today be called relatively small tactical nuclear weapons. And they killed 250,000 people. That's what they call tactical nuclear weapons these days. And so they're not small at all. One nuclear weapon can kill, you know, millions of people. And a number of nuclear weapons, even a small number, can cause the death of billions through a nuclear winter. So I think the more we can get this message out, the better. And another way that we're trying to increase the audience for this is, you know, I noticed when I first came into this role just 7 months ago that that the debate around nuclear weapons is really confined to the security and disarmament sphere by so-called experts, you know, talking about nuclear weapons policy. And a lot of these experts on mainstream television are coming from think tanks that are funded by the arms industry, that are funded by governments that have nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons in their defence policies. So, as I mentioned before, we all have a right to speak about this debate. You don't have to have specialist knowledge to know that if the world can be destroyed by these weapons should not exist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If the world can be destroyed by those weapons, we should not have them, even as a threat. My husband was at the United Nations, Dr. Robert Mueller, and he wrote a poem, Decide to be a Global Citizen. And in his poetry, he said, save your Mother Earth from her children who destroy her, divide her, and spike her with nuclear arms, who hold their territories to be greater than humanity. And I think that's what you're saying. Unite global citizens to save and heal our planet Earth and make Mother Earth bloom again in the beautiful planet that she was meant to be. Just think, if we had the end of nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear weapons, the peace that would bring to us mothers, as grandmothers, as citizens of the world. And I look at you and I think there is hope because you're getting the message out there. And I did hear you say, be sure you are not investing in anything that deals with nuclear weapons. And so you just have so many things we can do, but it's our voice. I never forget Maya Angelou saying, use your human voice and let people hear what you're thinking. And, you know, recently I went to a friend and I'm working on Ending War 101. And I said, I'm working on ending war. She went ballistic. She said, I can't stand war. And I couldn't even talk to her. So then I said to the next woman I met, the world is crying out for peace right now. And she could listen. Then I could talk to her. So it's the peace that brings us into harmony. So even though we're talking about nuclear weapons, to get them to be in the frame of mind so that you can have a conversation. That's why I wrote the book, Revolutionary Conversations. How do you have a conversation with somebody who's totally different than you are? And I remember my husband always playing his harmonica because it opened up their hearts. And when their hearts were open and they heard the ode to joy, do, 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 the world was one. And so we have to think of ways that we can start the conversation and ask them, I need some help. Why can you tell me how you feel like that? And tell me where, and just listen and then get in your point of view, because then I say, I'm taking a risk and I tell you about how I feel. And again, it's a conversation. And I'm sure you have had many opportunities at the UN, many opportunities in Australia for conversations, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really important too people are interested in different things in life. And I think to show that, nuclear weapons impact upon health.
Right.
And nuclear weapons impact upon human rights. I mean, there can be no greater violation of the right to life or the right to health or the right to a clean environment. Nuclear weapons impact on the environment. So many people are concerned about the environment. Well, every species will be harmed in a nuclear war. Only one species can stop it. By having these different kinds of messages, I think it's a way of getting to where people are and what they care about and being in the same place. And the other thing I learned, well, I think it all came very clear to me when I was in Japan in January this year. I visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time, which is, of course, extremely moving. And what struck me was that, you need the stories. You need the stories from those who have lived experience, and because that's all about opening up the heart. The human stories are what opens up the heart. And then you also need reason, or you need to talk about, the theory of nuclear deterrence and why it's a stupid theory and, very flawed. But you do that rationally, but you also need this other part, which is bringing in the heart. So I think the most effective advocate's going to use the two. You can't just be all about facts and figures and rational arguments, but you also can't just be doing it all on emotion. You have to have a sort of combination of both.
It's a nice kind of compromise. You have a little of this and of that, but the thing that I have learned, I was had the good fortune to work with Edward Bernays, who helped end World War II. And he said, tell your stories, tell the stories. That's what people remember. Robert always told his stories about the weapons that were always available to shoot their cousins. And he would talk about walking down the street and the cousins were shooting each other, Alsace-Lorraine and the French and the Germans. And he said that was the most terrible thing. We go home and have the same meal and then go out and shoot each other. He said that was so wrong. Well, now nuclear weapons is beyond shooting each other. That's beyond it. Now we're into destroying. And in 2017, ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize. Why? I'll let you tell them why.
It was for its work in highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for helping to get this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted by the General Assembly. And, when you say, you've got the phrase there behind you, peace is possible. Well, a lot of people said that getting this new treaty was not possible. And we know that, from the history of civil society movements, that a lot of people have said that things are not possible, like votes for women, ending slavery. All of those things seemed very difficult and were very difficult at the beginning. But it was through the efforts of everyday people, putting up constantly, doing their little bit, lighting their small candle every day, that made a difference. And it does make a difference. Anything you do, you could be an artist against the bomb. You could be, you can be a scientist. You can just be someone who writes a letter to the paper and says, well, why have we got nuclear weapons? All they can do is destroy. There's nothing positive about them. And so, I think that's the thing. If the most important thing is people can realize that they have their own individual agency, and it's what you do, whatever you can do within your own level of comfort and experience. And if you don't feel comfortable talking in front of a crowd, then you can organize things behind the scenes. What makes things easier is to get involved with a group of like-minded people. And I'm sure you would be aware of the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."
And that's Margaret Mead. I love Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead worked with John McConnell to create the first Earth Day. She and Mike were walking down the street, John McConnell, Robert Mueller, and Margaret Mead. And she says, "Oh, this Earth Day thing." And so John McConnell says, "Yes, this is the equinox and it's a solstice and we're going to have an Earth Day and we'd like you to be our leader." And so what does Margaret Mead say? She turns to my husband and says, "Okay, then, Dr. Mueller, you write my letter." And that's how Earth Day was started. 3 people walking down the street. And I can tell you about Wangari Maathai, how she took the courage to get a Nobel Peace Prize by having women plant trees. Think about it. Ordinary things. You have spoken about ordinary things and your passion and how doing what you can do makes a big difference, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, ICANN started with a small group of people sitting around a kitchen table in Melbourne saying, what can we do? And then within 10 years, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. They were a civil society movement made up of hundreds of partner organizations. So it was lots and lots of people doing lots of small things that led to that very big outcome.
Yes.
So I think, I think the important thing is just to do something positive every day and it does make a difference, I believe.
And we who have the gratitude in our hearts because we're free enough to make a difference, that we are not threatened by guns or nuclear weapons at this point in our life, we have a responsibility. I'm in constant gratitude, and my granddaughters are graduating this week and I'm going to go visit them. And they, I think, what is it that we can experience that will help the world understand that this is our time for peace. This is our time for peace. And the biggest threat we have is nuclear weapons. And I didn't realize that ICANN started in 2007 around a kitchen table. Isn't that exciting?
It is. And, there's another story about, in Japan, when the Hiroshima bomb and Nagasaki bombings happened, for a long time, people didn't understand about the radiation impacts of nuclear weapons. They understood about the blast and fire impacts, but they didn't know about the radiation impacts. So all of these people were coming down with these mysterious illnesses and diseases. And there was a lot of discrimination and stigmatization around that. And it wasn't until a Japanese fishing vessel was in the vicinity of a US nuclear weapons test, the biggest one US has ever done in the Marshall Islands, called Castle Bravo, that Japanese fishing vessel that was in the vicinity was, got the radioactive fallout on it. And those fishermen were immediately came down with lots of illnesses and sicknesses, and they were hospitalized upon their return to Japan, and then one of them died. And that was the beginning of the Japanese and the international recognition about the insidious radiation impacts of nuclear weapons, because before that, 9 years before that, nobody really realized. And so it was after that the housewives in Japan started a campaign, getting a petition going to say, raising awareness about contaminated tuna that they didn't want to feed their children. And so it was like housewives going house to house and, actually going really against the norms of Japan, and women being confined to the domestic sphere. And they took up this campaign, and it really made world headlines. And they realized when they did all this testing around the Pacific that this impact of radiation went thousands of kilometers away from where the tests had been done, and that people were horribly impacted along with the environment. And it really helped, in a sense that people recognized that those affected by the nuclear bombs in Japan, were suffering from radiation sickness, which helped for them to get a lot of less discrimination, stigmatization around what they were suffering. That there's all these connections, that are really interesting and telling. And it was only after that Castle Bravo incident and the fishing vessel incident that Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein issued their manifesto calling for an end to nuclear weapons and for peace, for peaceful approach to conflict. And we're really at a stage like that now. Actually, I think that the stage we're in right now is even more dangerous than during the height of the Cold War, because we have two major conflicts involving nuclear armed states and nuclear threats being made in both of those contexts. We've got a breakdown in arms control agreements and rising tensions in various parts of the world, and a new nuclear arms race underway. And so, it's never been more important or urgent for the international community to take action to eliminate nuclear weapons, to have a different way of thinking that Einstein called for, because that's really, in the end, that is the true enemy. The true enemy is not nuclear weapons or the countries that have them. It's the way of thinking that can justify these weapons. That is the real problem.
You're listening to Melissa Parke. I tell you, when you think about the ramifications of radiation, nuclear weapons, and the threat, and this is, as you said, the most urgent request we have today on our planet, to end the use of nuclear weapons, to end the storehouses of nuclear weapons. And with that request, I'm going to ask you, do you have a website where people can go and find out more about the TPNW and ICAN?
We certainly do. It's ICANW, ICANW.org. And there's all kinds of information about the TPNW and what you can do to get involved. And, there's a lot of young people involved. And I think that's the thing that gives me the most hope is young people being active on this. They can see the connections between nuclear weapons and the environment and health and human rights and all those other things. So they get it. It's just it's all the rest of us old folk that need to get on board now.
It's so beautiful to hear you say these words and to watch your expressions and to see that you're so passionate about the impact and how we each can make a difference. I think what I got today from you is that we are all part of the solution. And I remember Nelson Mandela saying, it always seems impossible until it's done. And this impossible threat is something that we each can do something about. I almost want to just sit here and listen to you for another hour, because your wisdom is so amazing. And the deterrent to peace is our own selves. We can become the peacemakers of this planet. Robert always said that. And he would say to people who would ask, "Oh, Dr. Mueller, how can you be so positive?" And I'm standing right there next to him. And I'm saying, "Yes, Robert, what do you think we should do?" And he said, "What are you thinking right now?" And he said that to the audience. And they were telling him about the wars that were going on and the unhappiness. And he said, "You know what I'm thinking about? The world I want, where my grandchildren will be at peace, where my wife can cook me a dinner and we can have dinner together in peace. That's the world I want. Why do you think I'm living in Costa Rica? So I can save at least 340 hectares of plants and animals and medicinal plants that I grow right there." And so he would tell people, watch what you're thinking. Your thoughts are powerful. You create the world with your dreams and your thoughts. And Melissa, I'm going to give you the last minute, and then I'm going to say thank you with all my heart. And I thank you too for giving me this opportunity to hear Melissa. Melissa, what's your dream for our planet today?
Well, I think there's no nuclear weapons on a sustainable planet, is what I think. And I think that's really important, what your husband said, to think about what it is that you want and imagine that. And if we all did that, imagine how powerful that would be. Because as I said before, nuclear weapons were first imagined before they were built. So let's imagine the end of them.
And with that, let's imagine that all nuclear weapons are no longer on our planet. And I thank you, Melissa, for being with us today. You know, it's not an easy task you have in front of you, but I think you're up for it. And I am so grateful. Just imagine sitting around a kitchen table in 2007 and getting the Nobel Peace Prize 10 years later. This is the kind of world that works when you have the luxury of peace, when you have the luxury to know that you can use your brain, the beautiful brain, and the destination that gives us the peace that we all deserve. And with that, I thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you to the audience.
Viewers, I want to thank you. If you wouldn't watch these podcasts to be informed and to become more knowledgeable about the threats on our planet and what we can do about them, we wouldn't be here. So Peace Podcast is for you, for our mutually assured survival. And I thank you. Each week you are going to have somebody that will inspire and maybe move you a little bit further down the road into peace. And with that, I thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye for now, Melissa.
Bye-bye.
Bye. It was my pleasure.